So, welcome back viewers. We're looking at classifying costs and income. We're looking at chapter 1 of the Introduction to Costing of the Osborne books. So let's get started. Costs can be classified by elements of cost. So this is a costing system. It's called costing by element. So each time you get a materials cost, you're going to see what materials I'm talking about, labour cost or expenses cost, then it will be allocated to these areas. So you can allocate it to material, you can allocate it to labour, or you can allocate it to expenses. This is costing by element. So raw materials, what they're talking about is for materials is raw materials. So for example, for Coke cans, you've got the aluminium or whatever Coke cans are made of. And then, so for stationery, you might have the wood for the pencil, you might have the lead for the pencil. These are all examples of materials that you need. Building materials would be, to build a house, like bricks would be an example of another type of material. So materials is basically the raw materials that you need to produce your product. Labour costs. So labour costs are basically the cost of workers. So you've got example of production line workers, you've got wages of salaries of office staffs, supervisors, maintenance staff, you've got accountants. So these are all labour costs. I think most people know what a labour cost is. Expenses, expenses that is anything else that's not labour or materials. So you have these kind of other costs that are not labour or materials. You've got rent and rates, you've got heating and lighting, you've got telephone, you've got advertising, you've got insurance. These are also known mainly as overheads. So overheads are basically periodic costs that are directly attributable to periods. So for example, rent and rates, you'll receive them periodically, basically. So each month you'll have to pay a certain amount of rent and rates. Generally heating and lighting, most of it is made up of standing charge, so it's quite similar each month. They're known as overheads because they'll be the same each month. So these are the things that you need to cover each month, basically. Income. So the vast majority of incomes come from the sale of goods and services, but others exist. So for example, you can rent out a building, get some rental income. You can earn interest in the bank. Yeah, I did say that. Obviously nowadays you can't really earn interest on the bank, but businesses that have loads of money in the bank normally can a little bit. Grants and allowances. Well, if you buy new machinery, for example, you get an allowance against the cost of the machinery, so you don't basically have to pay tax on that amount. That's what an allowance is. Grants is basically for research and development. You get grants from the government sometimes to help you out. Classification by function. So this is another way of classifying costs. There's three ways altogether: classification by element, classification by function, and direct or indirect. So we're going to look at function for now. So these are the four categories, I should say, categories of function. So you've got production, so you've got factory costs. So factory costs could be the production line workers, they could be the factory supervisor, anything to do with the factory heat and light, for example. Administration, so office staff, office other goods, anything to do with the office, like office stationery, for example, photocopiers, anything like that is administration. Normally administration there's a lot of stuff that gets lumped into there. Selling and distribution is mainly to do with selling and distributing, so marketing is normally included here. Delivery, sometimes marketing is included in administration for some reason, but normally it's in selling and distribution. Delivery, logistics, depends. Basically, it depends on your business and the way that they run it. So some people will classify it as administration because it suits their business. Finance, so you've got interest costs mainly. There's not many other types of costs here, just mainly to do with finance, so bank charges, things like that. Nature, so nature you've got direct and indirect costs. So direct is basically, actually we're going to look at that, so it's basically looking at the production line, and indirect is all other costs. So we'll look at direct costs in more detail. So direct costs is basically costs that are attributable to each unit of product. So each time you produce a product, the cost would go directly up with that. So for example, the production line workers, they're normally paid a salary, but if they're employed to capacity, so they're always producing, that means when they're working, they're going to be directly producing units of product which their wages are going to be used for. Obviously, if they're not done to capacity, then there is an excess there which could be classified in as an administration cost, or however the business wants to really classify it. Normally it's done by administration. But yeah, but in general, you'll find that production line workers are direct labour costs. Direct material costs are basically all the raw materials that are used to make your product. We've been through that already. Direct expenses, they're quite rare, so direct expenses are attributable to each unit of product. So variable electricity, so each time you produce something, you're going to use some electricity of a production line. So that will vary directly with the number of units. Whereas the standing charge for electricity obviously is not a direct cost because it won't go up directly with the amount of units that you produce. Indirect costs, so you've got materials such as cost of machinery oil, production line machinery. You've got indirect costs such as cleaners, supervisors, accountants. So anything like that is indirect cost because it's not going up each time you produce a new unit. So anything that goes up generally when you produce more units is the direct labour. Anything that's not is indirect labour. So accountant, for example, is an indirect labour. Indirect expenses, heat and light, rent. Normally the indirect costs are also said to be overheads. Sorry, this is not making much sense. Yes, indirect costs. So sales overheads are an example as well. So these are the you've got 3 ways to classify costs. So you can cost by element. So let's highlight that in one colour. Then you can cost by function. Let's highlight that in another colour. So that colour is very similar, isn't it? Anyway, let's just leave it like that. And then you can cost by nature. Okay, so these are the 3 ways that you can classify costs. I'm going to just take away the colours. Element is materials, labour and expenses. Function is production, administration, selling and distribution and finance. And nature is direct and indirect. So let's go through an example now. So you've got this company, Interwood Manufacturing. So you've got insurance for buildings, wages for football stitchers, people that stitch up the footballs, you've got leather for footballs, you've got advertising, you've got bank overdraft, you've got wages of factory maintenance staff. Okay, so this is a periodic cost, so that will be an expense, won't it? And it will be indirect because it's not going up with each unit, so it will be indirect expense. So wages of football stitchers, so the people that stitch the footballs, that's a labour cost, isn't it? So that's a labour cost, and this will be direct, won't it? Because it's going directly up with each kind of so here we're classifying by nature and we're classifying by element. This is the most common way of doing it. We'll do function as well in a minute. So once we've done by element and nature, we'll do function as well, so you can see that as well. Level for footballs, obviously this is a material and it's direct because each unit of product you're going to be using more product. Advertising, obviously this is a periodic cost, so it's an expense, it's an overhead really, and it's indirect because each unit is not going to necessarily, you can do a whole load of advertising, so you can advertise, say you've done like £1 million worth of advertising, it's not necessarily going to impact on how many units you produce. Well, it's not going to at all actually. Well, it could do. I mean, your sales could go up, which means that you need to produce more. But there's a very long time before that happens, really. Bank overdraft interest. Well, this is a finance cost. it's so we're looking at paying it here. So this will be an indirect expense. It's an expense because it's not direct labour or direct materials, so it's got to be an expense, and it's indirect because it's not going to change with each unit. Telephone lines. So telephone lines is an overhead normally, or it is an overhead, and so that will be an expense, and it's indirect because it's not going to be affected by how many units you produce. It's not going to be directly attributable to each unit that you produce. Wages of factory maintenance staff. So this is a production. This is an indirect cost. The reason is that it's maintenance and not the actual production. So it's going to be indirect, and obviously wages is labour. Okay, let's now rub this out and classify by function. So normal function, you've got production, administration, selling and distribution, and finance. So insurance for buildings, that would be an admin cost because it doesn't fall into any of the other categories. Could actually, for building, it could be a production cost. It doesn't say factory building. Actually, it couldn't. It's anything that is production should say factory normally. So here we can classify this as administration because it doesn't say factory. So if it said insurance of factory building, then we would classify this with a P for production. Wages of football stitchers. So this is a direct cost of production, so that would be P. Leather for footballs. This is a direct cost of production as well, so be P. Advertising, that's normally a selling and distribution cost. Bank overdraft, this is a finance cost. Telephone lines, this is an administration cost normally. Wages of factory maintenance staff, well this is a factory cost, so we're looking at production here, so this will be a production cost. Okay, thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next lesson.